and welcome to another episode of Nothing Like a Good Book. And this is no exception. You know, the last World War, World War II, the recipient, the very last recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor, the MOH, Hershel Woody Williams, will receive another of the greatest honors granted as an individual by the United States government. Now, Williams, who unfortunately passed away at the age of 98 last June 29th, not so long ago, he'll lie in honor at the U.S. Capitol. The date has not yet been announced, but Woody Williams received the Medal of Honor, the highest medal for valor in the United States military. This is for his actions on Iwo Jima Island on February 23rd, 1945. This is when he used a flamethrower against the Imperial Japanese Army positioned in fortified underground pillboxes. And you know, out of the 669,100 Marines who fought in World War II, only 82 were awarded the MOH. Boy, oh boy. Now, the biographer of this wonderful book on this gentleman, Dr. Bryan Mark Rigg, is my very special guest. And it's all about the biography of Woody Williams, the last World War II Medal of Honor recipient, who will soon lie in honor at the U.S. Capitol. Welcome, Dr. Bryan.
Hey, thank you, Mark, so much for having me.
Wow, I tell you what, a Japanese air base used stage attacks on U.S. bombers in the Pacific. Iwo Jima, it was an important strategic target, and 20,000 Japanese were entrenched in underground tunnels and bunkers on Iwo Jima, ready to fight to the end. And the battles, on Iwo Jima were some of the bloodiest in Marine Corps history, but the Leathernecks prevailed, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. They did. But people need to realize that 30% of all Marines who died in World War II died on Iwo Jima. It was a battle that they thought was only going to take a week. They thought there was around 10,000 Japanese there, and there was over 20,000. And it was a slugfest because the Japanese had built 11 miles of tunnels in an 8-square-mile island. And so it was hard to get to them because they weren't on the island. They were in the island. And 2,000 of the 20,000 men that General Kuribayashi had defending that island were combat engineers that he had working almost a whole year of making this an impenetrable fortress. And it was the worst battle in the Pacific for Americans, percentage-wise, as far as kill ratios of any other battle. The Japanese general was the most brilliant general that we met during the Pacific War. So it was a horrific battle.
Well, I got to tell you, Flamethrower is the only book on World War II endorsed by 2 Marine Corps commandants, U.S. Marine Corps 31st Commandant General Charles C. Krulak, and USMC 29th Commandant General Al Gray, and a Marine Corps general too, General Anthony C. Zinni, USMC retired. And it was also endorsed by the former head of the Marine Corps Historical Division, as well as a famous author of Chesty, Colonel John Hoffman. And folks, you can find Flamethrower on Amazon, Audible as well, and the author's website. Okay, we'll be going into all of that throughout the show. Well, why is the Medal of Honor important, Bryan? Tell me.
Well, it's symbolic of the sacrifices that the larger whole made during World War II. I mean, the medal started during the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln brought it into being because he wanted to honor the incredible bravery and sacrifices our men and women were making during the Civil War. And here again, it is symbolic of the larger sacrifices that the collective whole was making at this time. I mean, we lost 420,000 men and women in combat and 16.3 million served. And so having the Medal of Honor is the highest level of valor that a valorous award that you can get in the American military, first off. Like you mentioned, out of 669,000 Marines, only 82 got the Medal of Honor, and only a little over 30 of them got it and were still alive after the act. Right. Most of the guys got it posthumously. So, it is for extraordinary acts beyond the call of duty. And so when a person gets the Medal of Honor in America, he becomes part of the military pantheon on Mount Olympus of these military gods, if you will. These people are basically beyond reproach. They almost become infallible when they give critiques on presidents and military issues.
Mm-hmm.
When a person with the Medal of Honor walks into a room, if there are generals, there is an unwritten code and honor that you stand up and salute the medal because of what it represents. So, like in the British Empire, the Victorian Cross is highly esteemed and for incredible acts of valor. Same thing with the Medal of Honor for Americans. And it is something that, especially within the military culture, if somebody's wearing the Medal of Honor, it basically gets incredible respect. But it's also the symbol of the medal as well for American history and the values of why we send our men and women into combat to defend freedom, democracy, and human rights. And so the medal is full of a lot of symbols.
So how does the military award an MOH?
It's a very involved process, and this is something I go into my book with in depth. In fact, General Al Gray said this was the most thorough researched, a book that he's ever read when going into how Medal of Honor, recipients receive the medal, the whole process. So, when somebody does something extraordinary like Woody Williams did on Iwo Jima, what happens is it takes an officer to write this person up. And the sad thing is most officers died on Iwo Jima. So there's a lot of men who did not get recognized for their bravery on Iwo Jima because they just didn't have the officers to put them in for it. I mean, 27 men nonetheless still got medals of honor from Iwo Jima.
Mm-hmm.
Percentage-wise, one of the highest decorated battles we've ever had in the history of the United States. So how it gets started, once again, you have to have your officer put you in for it. Then once that gets put in, it slowly makes its way up the chain of command. First it goes to battalion level, 1,000 men. Then it goes to regimental level, 3,000 men. Then it goes to divisional level, that's 20,000 men. Then it goes to corps level, that's 3 divisions, 60, 70,000 men. And then you get up to Fleet Marine Force commander, who's in charge of all the divisions during World War II, Roy Geiger. And he was in charge of 6 divisions. And he and his board would have to sanction it before it would go to the commander of the Pacific, Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz and his board.
Boy.
Then it would get sanctioned there, taken to the head of the Navy, Ernst King. And then it would be fast-tracked over to the Secretary of Navy to be able to be presented before the president to sign off on it. So the multiple levels and the amount of brass that had to go over all the documents and so on to award a person a Medal of Honor is very complicated, very in-depth. It takes a lot of time. And I went into 20 out of the 27 at Iwo Jima, using them as case studies to describe how this process is done. And most people have never heard about the backstories of some of these famous Medal of Honor recipients from World War II that our ships are being named after, whether it be, Jack Lucas,
right.
Or whether it be, Cole or, and others, in the larger, in the Pacific campaign, whether it be Pappy Boynton and so on. I go into depth in this and describe it in detail.
So overall, what does the life of Woody teach us about World War II, trauma and heroism?
Woody was a very brave man in combat, or I should say a brave kid. I mean, he was 19 when he was drafted, and he saw his first combat, as a 20-year-old on Guam, and then a 21-year-old on Iwo Jima. His life is symbolic of the sacrifice that millions of men and women made during World War II and what it takes to defend freedom. I mean, 420,000 died and gave the ultimate, sacrifice for our nation. So Woody is symbolic now, especially now lying in state as if he was a president of the United States. He's symbolic of all that hard-earned fight that we and victory that we got by sending our men and women off to fight Hitler and Hirohito. And what that entailed was going into horrific battle quite often, and seeing your buddies get blown up and die, and then those who survived living with those scars. So Woody also talked an awful lot about the PTSD he struggled with, how he found meaning in life later on, how he gave back tremendously to the communities throughout America with the Gold Star family monuments to commemorate those men and women, those fathers and mothers who have sacrificed a son or a daughter for this nation, and how important it is to be grateful.
Right.
So, I mean, Woody's life, when you go into it, you learn what you have to do power projection to defeat your enemies, that freedom is not free. And then the cost of freedom, once you bring these people back, what you need to be doing to take care of them, and then how you preserve the proper memory of honoring those people who have sacrificed a loved one. So there's many different things that his life brings out that I explore thoroughly in my book, Flamethrower.
Well, let's talk about, because a lot I want to get through, but I want to understand the campaigns, that Woody took part in. I mean, how they in turn, shaped strategy and policy during the Pacific War.
Yeah, well, the one thing that I found that was fascinating, speaking of strategy and operations, and I kind of jumped in here, and unless you had a specific question right off of that, I hope I didn't cut you off, Mark.
No, not at all.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So the one thing that I found that was fascinating, when you look at kind of like the global perspective of what, the campaign was all about and what studying this teaches us, the one thing I really got excited about exploring when you look at Woody and what his unit was doing on Guam in 44 and then Iwo Jima in 45 is that they would have never really got there at the times that they did had the Marine Corps not developed the amphibious warfare operational doctrine in the 20s and 30s that they did. If we didn't learn how we could hit an enemy beach quickly, effectively, and land a lot of equipment and a lot of soldiers in a small amount of time, you don't have the invasion of North Africa. You don't have the invasion of Normandy. You don't have Okinawa. You don't have Iwo Jima. You don't have Tarawa. And so what's really remarkable, and I quote several historians that support me with this assessment, is that if you don't have the focus of amphibious warfare in your crosshairs in the 20s and 30s, World War II would have ended probably in 46 and 47, not 45. And if Hirohito and Hitler had a couple of more years to do their death and destruction in Europe and Asia, God only knows the million more people, innocent people, we would have lost, and how much more effort it would have taken to defeat these horrible regimes. Yeah. So that's one thing I found that was fascinating to study with Flamethrower is the evolution of tactics and hardware and engineering that was necessary in order to defeat Hitler and Hirohito. And that's on the 10,000 foot views with the ships, that I talk about. I mean, when we got attacked at Pearl Harbor, we had 350 ships in our Navy. At the end of the war, we had 8,800. Don't mess with us.
Yeah, right.
We're going to come back and we're going to hit you hard. But it also teaches how important it is to have power projection from the sea. And like I said, the amphibious warfare was really critical. But then I go down into kind of the microscopic level and saying, okay, one part of the success of these amphibious warriors was the flamethrower. And, 1/3 of all Japanese who died on Iwo Jima and Okinawa were incinerated. They were burned alive because you couldn't shoot them, couldn't blow them up because they were in the island. So these effective weapons that we had to defeat the Japanese, from massive ships and aircraft carriers down to the flamethrower, was all critical in a collective whole. How you actually take on these enemies, you adapt and improvise your strategy to meet the operational needs that you have. And I found that absolutely fascinating. And I go into a deep dive in this book, documenting that important aspect of the Pacific War.
I'm speaking with Dr. Bryan Mark Rigg. He is the biographer of Woody Williams, and the last World War II Medal of Honor recipient, who just died recently. You may have seen it on the news. But let me ask you this one, Bryan. Why is there a controversy surrounding Woody's medal?
I wasn't expecting to find this when I was doing my research. I was on the island with Woody, Iwo Jima, and Guam, by the way, both in 2015 and 2018. But as I was exploring his metal process, what I was shocked to find is that as I gave you all the different levels that the metal had to go through and get approved at each level, I found that Woody's metal was stopped by General Geiger at the Fleet Marine Force level. He was the commander of all Marine divisions, and he and his board of 6 officers decided that there was not the evidence for this. So he conferred with Chester Nimitz and his board, and they also agreed that there wasn't enough evidence to make this a Medal of Honor, and they stopped the process. Then Geiger got in touch with Woody's platoon commander, who led the whole action that entire day. He had trained with Woody for 6 months. He knew all the men inside and out, and he was there and he witnessed everything Woody did. And Geiger said, hey, we have evidence that's been presented that doesn't match up with the sample citation and the first endorsement. There's something wrong here. You can clarify things. Not only did the general ask the platoon commander once, he asked him twice to give evidence, and he refused to do so. So as a result, they weren't going to push it forward. You do not get a Medal of Honor if you have a broken chain of command of endorsements going up to the president. It just doesn't happen. Well, President Truman had just become a president. He just won the war. He made the controversial decision to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And as every president likes to do, if he can, he likes to have a Medal of Honor ceremony, especially commemorating the war. He won it. It's a bipartisan activity. And he didn't want to give medals of honor to weeping widows and crying mothers. He wanted to give medals of honor to actual alive recipients. And there were 3 that were outstanding at this time, Woody being one of them. And make a long story short, Truman put pressure on the Secretary of the Navy to get this done. And this has never happened, according to Commandant Charles Krulak. He's never heard of this ever happening.
Right.
The Secretary of the Navy pulled it away from Admiral Nimitz and General Geiger and fast-tracked it and awarded it. So it's, according to General Krulak and also historian Colonel Hoffman, and they both said this was one of the most messed up Medal of Honor processes that they had ever seen. So that's the controversy in short.
Well, thank God it got through and got straightened out for where it needed to be.
Absolutely. I mean, Woody has worn it with honor. He got it fair and square. President Truman signed off on it, but it was a bizarre process of him getting the medal, no doubt.
Well, you mentioned earlier, a lot of people have seen movies and so on. I'm going to touch on that in a second, but the flamethrower was so important. Wow, what is that?
Yeah, so, you had 2 flamethrowers. You see a little bit of this.
No, I didn't mean that. I meant the wind in the background.
I'm sorry, Mark.
Something, are you?
Oh, well, you know what? I went outside as you said it was okay to do so.
No, well, it's been good. But listen, here's my question. Clint Eastwood, he produced 2 movies on Iwo Jima, right? Highlighting the sacrifice of both sides there. I mean, it's pretty bad. You mentioned before about the incineration and so on. For people to read and imagine that and then, how cruel we were, yeah. Well, I can tell you now as an Australian and what our diggers went through up on the Kokoda Trail and on the bridge of the River Kwai, if they want to go and see something, the Japanese were just as ruthless, I can tell you. And the reality is, what did you find that was historically accurate and not accurate from what he presented to the American public?
Well, the sad thing is, and I think he was playing politics at the time because he had to present the Japanese in a certain way, or they wouldn't have let them, him and his crew visit the island and do the filming on Iwo Jima that he did. But, the one thing that Clint Eastwood, of course, we don't rely on Hollywood to tell the truth about history. They want to tell a good story. But the one thing I found out that was just shocking about the Japanese is that many of the Japanese that were in his command at Iwo Jima were raping, killing thugs all throughout China. Mm-hmm. Japan slaughtered 30 million people during World War II, and they raped probably more than that, by an exponential amount. They were grotesque country, fascist-oriented, uncaring, xenophobic, and absolutely ruthless with dominating the areas that they did. The rape of Nanking, which a lot of people know about, is just one of hundreds of campaigns like that. You can write a book called The Rape of Hong Kong, The Rape of Singapore, The Rape of Indonesia, The Rape of Beijing, and I could go on and on and on. And so Kuribayashi, being a general, had participated in many campaigns in China. Most notoriously, he was second in command of the 23rd Army that took over Hong Kong. Within 1 month, his troops, who he led, slaughtered 50,000 civilians and raped over 10 million women. Mm-hmm. 10,000 women. He's just horrible. And he brought in thousands of women for comfort stations and so on. So he was a war criminal in every sense of the word. And you don't get that from Clint Eastwood. And also the way the Japanese are presented, you don't get the feeling that these people were uncaring people who had already slaughtered, thousands of people under their command in China and other places. So you don't get that sense of how horrible the Japanese nation under Hirohito was at this time and the crimes that they had committed. Also, you get a sense of how radical they were. Clint Eastwood does a pretty good job of that. But I don't think you really get the sense of that the Japanese had a 98% fatality rate. They, while many modern armies say we're going to fight to the death, Japan in modern warfare is the only one that's proved it.
Yes.
And so fighting these religious fanatics that were well trained, it's like, we see the religious fanatics now a lot of times in the Islamic world, blowing themselves up to get their 72 virgins and whatnot. Just imagine if you have a whole bunch of guys like that, but they're in a modern military, well organized, and they all are fanatic, thinking they're going to the Yakasuni shrine later on, and they're Valhalla, and they're going to become gods and kami and spirits and whatnot. And I really describe that in depth in my book. And that's one thing the movies have not got right yet about depicting the Japanese how they really were, which is really hard to stomach when you study them closely.
Well, Iwo Jima, it's extremely important to American history, more than people realize. But we've got just about to close. I want to ask you, how did Iwo Jima then shape the policy, do you think, to drop the atomic bombs on Japan?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, when American leaders are looking at going, okay, we had to bring almost 1,000 ships, 250,000 men, and we had to rotate on and off the island 80,000 Marines and a few Army grunts to take over this island of only 20,000. How much more is it going to take over the 4 main islands of Japan that have 4.5 military regulars and then 20 million militia who will fight to the death? So as our leaders are looking at the cost that we lost 7,000 dead, 19,000 injured, and taking over 8 square miles, what's it going to be like when we take over the landmass of California that Japan represents with the 4 islands? This is just too heavy a cost. FDR was already getting so much pushback for the sacrifices that were made on Iwo Jima. He didn't want to have to start talking to, 7,000 mourning mothers and wives is enough to begin with. When you're looking at the projections were 1 million dead to take over the 4 islands of Japan, FDR did not want to see that. And later on, Truman didn't want to see that. We need to remember that it's only when we occupied almost the entirety of Germany, had split it in half, and Hitler killed himself, that Germany surrendered. How much more so would it have taken with Japan, who was much more fanatic than the Germans, if that was possible? I love the quote from General Cates. He was one of the commanding generals on Iwo Jima, and he said, and he fought the Germans in World War I. He said, if the Germans had the fanaticism of the Japanese and the Japanese had the discipline and the weapons of the Germans, we most likely would have lost this war. And I think that's what they were looking at, of just the human cost that it would have taken to take over Japan by looking in the rearview mirror at Iwo Jima. they're like, we got, the President Truman and his advisor said, we have to drop the bombs. We are not going to lose 1 million men when we can get rid of this regime with a couple of bombs.
Well, the book is called the autobiography Flamethrower. It's written by Dr. Bryan Mark Rigg, and it's the biography of Woody Williams. And God rest his soul, the last World War II Medal of Honor recipient, who will soon lie in honor at the U.S. Capitol. And a little bit about this author. Dr. Rigg, he's a recipient of the 2002 William E. Colby Award for his work on Hitler's Jewish soldiers. And he received his undergraduate degree from Yale, earning honors in history, and the university subsequently awarded him the Henry Fellowship to study at Cambridge Uni, where he received his MA and PhD. And since then, he has written 5 acclaimed books. He's no novice to this game on World War II and the Holocaust, and his newest title, Conquering Learning Disabilities at Any Age. So let's hope this one, it's going to be compelling reading. There's no doubt about it. There's a lot in it. Where can it be got, Brian? Tell us.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, if people are interested in knowing more about my books, they can go to my website, which is bryanmarkrigg.com. Brian with a Y like in Yankee, Mark with a K like in Kilo, like yours, and then Rigg, R-I-G-G. And if they want to purchase my books, they can go on Amazon. Flamethrower is there, and Audible, Kindle, and hardback version. So thank you very much, Mark, for letting me put that information out there. So if people want to buy the book, they can.
Wonderful work. Wonderful work. We tend to forget this day and age, and particularly youth don't appreciate what all our boys went through, what everybody went through during those years. And it's books like these that just keep them in touch, make them understand how lucky we really are. So thank you for that, and very, very good luck with this book.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thanks for having me on your show.